thank you for coming to the second event of Disability Equity Week. Today, our presentation is on representation of disability in literature and culture by Dr. Shannon Wooden. Dr. Wooden is a faculty member in the English department, and I'm sure she'll give us some great information. A couple note-taking things. So after the session, there will be a question and answer part of the presentation. So if everyone could stay muted and just ask any questions you have in the chat. Afterwards, I'll read them out loud and have give Dr. Wooden a chance to answer those questions. Also, at the very end of the session, there will be a survey that I will post in the chat. It's a quick 5-question survey, and we would just love your feedback to hear about what we could change and kind of make better in the future. And then also the session is being recorded. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll hopefully get this up on the Disability Resource Center website. So if you want to refer back to it or send it to a coworker who wasn't able to make it, we would love y'all to do that. So yeah, without further ado, I'll let Dr. Wooden take it over.
Thank you, Austin, and hello everyone, and thank you for coming. I need to figure out how to shrink my gallery view because I wanted to see everybody as they arrived, and now I can't see my notes. Okay. Success. I have too many windows open. I am Shannon Wooden. I'm in the English department here at Missouri State University, and I coordinate the Disability Studies minor. So unlike some of the other presentations at Disability Equity Week, mine is really academic. It's really about a kind of intellectual and academic foray into issues of disability. And on one of the next slides, I'll say a little bit more about what that is and why we do it. But especially like relative to the session that was yesterday afternoon, this has maybe less practical advice and more what I hope is kind of intellectual stimulation that will influence the way you engage in a world that is not yet ideologically built to be really for people with disabilities. So by way of introduction to the topic, I think this talk is going to go about somewhere right around 30 minutes. And then I'd love to have conversation about whatever pieces of it seemed especially interesting to you. So I talk kind of fast. If I need to go back and say more about something, I would be happy to do that. And obviously, if you've just got ideas and things you want to say that aren't especially questions, I'm very interested in hearing those as well. Okay, by way of introduction, I want to acknowledge that this talk is represents the tip of a vast and really interesting iceberg. The topic of disability in culture is huge, and it has lots of disciplinary and theoretical inroads. One might focus, for instance, on questions of representation, insisting that disabled people always be involved in cultural productions about disabled people. One might be especially interested in questions of language and rhetoric, or questions of stigmatizing, or questions of history, from literary and cultural history to medical and sociological history, or legal and political history. And none of these questions are ever very far from urgent socio-political issues that people with disabilities face. So this talk, taking on a very small part of the tip of this very big iceberg, is a quick distillation of what might occupy an entire class offered out of the English department. The good news is it's a class that I teach. So if you're interested, you can learn more about it every other fall, pretty much. And you could also check out our Disability Studies minor if you want to go more interdisciplinarily beneath the surface. Another thing to keep in the back of your mind is that this topic is situated in time to a pretty significant extent. In more traditional literary studies, it might not matter if a text is 5 years old or 25 years old. Contemporary is a category that spans decades sometimes. But for this topic, we might mark time around the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, recognizing the intense activism that led up to it and the progress that has been made since. This is not to say that activism is no longer necessary. On the contrary, as the ADA did not instantly and magically create universal access and equity. It's just to note that a movie that I watched in high school, for instance, might be a movie that I watch very differently today. And I'm not that old. Okay, So I started my inquiries into disability studies via children's media, in part because I had children. And so I was really frequently exposed to children's media. My first forays into interpreting children's media led me to some frank and very compelling attitudes about the power of media to shape a society's idea of normalcy. Henry Giroux on the pedagogical power of Disney said, quote, "The products associated with children's culture now garner at least as much cultural authority and legitimacy for teaching specific roles, values, and ideals as more traditional sites of learning." As a parent, then, I want to be attuned to what my children might be learning from media. But as a cultural and literary critic, I'm interested in how cultural expressions are built to do this work. Giroux goes on to say, quote, "The authority of such films as the Disney films stems from their unique form of representation and their ever-growing presence within a media apparatus equipped with dazzling technology, sound effects, and imagery packaged as entertainment." So I love to talk not only about this construction of visual pleasure that Giroux mentions, but also narrative shapes, a kind of visual shorthand, the emotional reinforcement of certain textual features. In this talk, I really just focus on a couple of those things, but really once you start looking into any text, you can find examples of kind of all the things all the time. And I find the step from children's media to more kind of grown-up media is so slight as to be barely noticeable. These truths certainly don't stop holding at age 15. And in a culture increasingly saturated by visual narrative that appeals to both children and adults, the power of cultural media to shape normalcy cannot be underestimated. It occurs to me that I haven't mentioned, if any of you are listening to me but can't see me, um, anytime I use any derivation of the word normal, it is to be implied that I'm using air quotes, right? Normal is the thing that you can't say without recognizing that it is a linguistic gesture at a thing that is kind of nothing, right? It's a thing that is a construct and a creation. So please don't ever interpret me as saying normal as if it ever stands on its own. Okay, disability studies, which works according to shared principles with, but is not identical to, disability accommodation or special education or even disability rights advocacy, is an academic field that offers a kind of systemic analysis into the fundamental concept of disability: what it is, what causes it, how we talk about it, how we build a society on or around or in response to or despite it. The Society for Disability Studies gives us some very useful language for describing the field. It is interdisciplinary, for one thing, across humanities, sciences, and social sciences. Moreover, it depends on what is called the social model of disability and other challenges to more common and more medical understandings of disability. The social model, in short, proposes that disability is created not by the fact of or in the impaired body or its impairment. That is the idea that you're disabled because your spinal cord is broken and so you can't walk, but in the relationship between the body and its environment. Let me say that again. Disability is created in the relationship between a body and its environment. You are disabled because you can't walk and normal society demands walking. You are disabled not by blindness, but by the fact that normalcy demands that you experience visual stimulation to the same degree that most do. The social model reminds us that nobody is ever able-bodied, another word that is always in air quotes, but that ability is a construct of normalcy. So one who is not disabled is actually being enabled by the environment in which they live. Another great example. I am on the second story of a building right now. As the person in a non-enabled body, I have no business up here. I cannot fly. I cannot levitate. I probably can't even climb this high in a tree. Fortunately, though, my house has stairs in it and my body is suited to that accommodation. My needs match my environment. Ergo, non-disabled. If I had the stairs, but also had wheels, I would be disabled. If I had wheels, but I had a ramp, I would be enabled again. My disability is not located in my legs or in my spinal cord, in other words, and certainly not in my wheels, but in the relationship between my body and my architecture. By now, another aside, you may have noticed that in a general context like this, I kind of use person first language and identity first language interchangeably. There are so many arguments about the rhetorical effect of either, that in general, I'm convinced that there's more good done by the interrogation of the question than by just sort of picking one. As was recommended in the panel yesterday, on a person by person basis, one should do what the person in question prefers. And I teach my students that it's crucial to consider whether disability descriptors are even necessary to what you're trying to say about a person, and obviously learn names and use them whenever possible. But in general terms, I find person first language mandates kind of unconvincing at best. This is a question for another time, but if you heard me doing that, it is, I've got more to say about it if you would want to hear that. Okay, one more foundational observation. Returning to the question of media analysis. We are all of us always in the process of interpreting people. We interpret people's words and their outfits and their claims to various kinds of status, but we also interpret bodies, and we do this without even thinking about it. Irving Goffman in the 1960s described how our practices of interpreting might lead to what's called stigma, specifically when our expectations, our interpretive frames, so to speak, are challenged by the presence of someone who doesn't meet those expectations, especially when our expectations have been so internalized that they become unconscious demands. So, for instance, if I expect that the President of the United States is a man, or should always be a man, and I'm confronted with a woman, right? If I expect a nurse to be a woman and I'm confronted with a man, or if I expect gender to be binary and visible, and I'm confronted with a body whose gender I cannot easily read, or whose body and name don't seem to match, my internalized expectations are not met, and I react to that mismatch, right? More than I react directly to the body that's in front of me. Not every mismatch leads to harmful stigmatizing. Sometimes we are pleasantly surprised when our expectations are not met, but often this occasion produces a disciplinary response to reestablish, I should say, previously held ideas of normalcy. Okay, thought experiment. These sites of mismatch can range from relatively innocuous to very, very damaging. I encounter a woman and I assume she's maternal. I encounter a Black student and assume he went to a subpar high school. I encounter a person in a wheelchair and assume that she's probably depressed. Any of these things might be true, and any of these things might be false. But asking a single woman when she's going to have kids, arguably, is merely rude, while not treating a person in a wheelchair for depression because you think their sadness is somehow natural can be deadly. The other piece of stigma from Goffman is the tendency to attach multiple negative characteristics to a single visible characteristic. If we stigmatize Blackness, for instance, it's not only because we hold whiteness as the norm. I expect to see whiteness, so I'm surprised when I see Blackness, leading to stigma, but because we associate Blackness with other unrelated things. So that subpar school that I imagined when I encountered my Black student becomes part of a package that might include everything from the lack of that person's intellectual or economic potential to a literal life of crime, to my fear of being in danger around that person. My stereotypes, in other words, are built on the interpersonal and sociological processes of stigmatizing. So, stigmatizing and relying on stereotypes may be dangerous, and these things are very closely related. But just saying, don't do that, right? Knock it off, don't stigmatize people, it isn't nice, is quite a bit less effective than learning why we do it. So we can call it into the light and examine it, try to learn from it, not do it anymore. This inference graphic on the screen, I think, is interesting because I'm sure the emphasis is supposed to be on the whole thing, and it's supposed to be kind of an instructive statement on how to draw inferences. But I want to call out that last phrase for its kind of implicit nod to ideology. If inference is based on our understanding of the world, and our understanding of the world is flawed, becoming conscious of how we make inferences and what they reveal about our understanding of the world is an opportunity to rethink that understanding. Okay, so kids are really good at inferring. They know from very early on that Milhouse's glasses mean that he's a nerd, that Supergirl's hair signifies whether she's supposed to be smart or powerful at any given moment, that Buzz's broken arm will likely lead him into existential despair and a sense of worthlessness. The top left image on the screen takes place at the end of a short animated video that's been shared on YouTube literally millions of times. The point of the video is to be grateful for what you have because somebody's always got it worse. So it starts with like a helicopter, and then it moves down the scale of posh vehicles to, I don't know, sports car, to there's a Hummer in there somewhere, to sedan, to clunker, to city bus, to walking, right? This is the last image. The poor, sad wheelchair user who is inexplicably on an upper floor and literally behind bars. As he looks at the guy walking, his thought bubble says, laments, "You can go anywhere you want." Shockingly few people, judging from the YouTube comments at least, seem to have read this video as stigmatizing or perpetuating stigma. They all see it as a beautiful reminder to be grateful for what you have because it can always get worse. But once you see it, my disability studies students' jaws drop when I show it after even one short conversation about stigmatizing. I call this visual metaphor. People aren't seeing the wheelchair as a prosthetic device, and they aren't seeing the wheelchair user as a disabled person. On the contrary, they're seeing the image of the wheelchair person combo as a signifier for the next worst thing in this sequence. The short film only works if you read the image in that way. It literally depends upon your reading the image in that way and not say, here is a picture of a super awesome wheelchair rugby star who's waiting for his friends to arrive and is annoyed because their limo is late, right? So visuals contribute very powerfully to narrative storytelling and are, as this example shows, frequently read in terms of how the narrative has situated them. That visuals contribute powerfully to narrative meaning making is not a coincidence. It's literally how film is made. Like, it's the whole reason for film to exist as an art form. It's particularly fun, I think, to look at animation where anything is possible in terms of representing bodies. But in my experience so far, animation has not realized its full potential. When I took my kids and a couple of their friends to see Monsters University in 2013, they were like 6 and 10. They reported afterwards 2 truths. One, they hated this guy, Johnny Worthington. He is the bully, not the protagonist in that film. And their hating him was a narrative conclusion. That's where the story led them. But 2, his fraternity was clearly the cool one, which seems to be a visual conclusion. Johnny Worthington, however big a bully, still has the right body relative to the nerds of the Uzma Kappa fraternity. I asked the kids first who they liked and then what group they would prefer to join. And they unanimously said they liked the dorky Uzma Kappa guys, but of course everyone wanted to be in Roar Omega Roar. The narrative alone should have led them to the opposite conclusion on the RORs, but the visuals worked as they were designed to do. to perpetuate the social privileging of certain bodies over others. Ironically, this use of disability as a visual metaphor frequently renders disability experiences invisible. David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, in a book called Narrative Prosthesis, Disability and the Dependencies of Discourse, say that disability pervades literary narrative, is in perpetual circulation, and that narratives even rely upon disability as a narrative device, but that we tend to screen images of disability out. This use of the invisibility of disability is not about what's called invisible disabilities like mental illness, right? The impairments that are not frequent, that are not easily accessible on site, right? But refers to a kind of overarching cultural blindness. We do not or cannot see the numerous instances of disability that may be right in front of us. Narrative media features bodily impairment, temporary or otherwise, as such a frequent and consistent trope that we have trained ourselves to read for the trope. So we skip right over the body in our rush to the metaphor. The wheelchair user at the end of the Be Grateful video is a great example of this. Since he must function as a visual trope, he has to function as a signifier of an undesirable thing, the next worst thing. We read him or we read that image without seeing him or disability at all. Moreover, our failure to see him as a person who uses a wheelchair means that we don't see through the social model. So we don't see any systemic problems, but just a presumably natural meaning. One might say, why is his apartment upstairs? Or does the elevator not work? Or is that bus not wheelchair accessible? But no one does. Instead, we say, oh, poor guy, he can't go where he wants. So another thought experiment, because as I said, this project began with children's media. How many examples of disability can you think of from the Pixar movies? Toy Stories 1 through 4, A Bug's Life, Up, The Incredibles, WALL-E, Finding Nemo, Finding Dory, Brave, Monsters Inc., Monsters University, Coco, etc. Right, my kids are older now, so I sort of lost the thread in the last few years. But I've given numerous talks like this one, and people usually stare at me for just a second and then say, Nemo. Of course, by social model thinking, Nemo isn't disabled. He's got a lucky fin, sure, but the entire plot of Finding Nemo is built on his ability to swim too well rather than not well enough, right? He gets captured when he swims up to touch the boat. In addition, relative ability and arguably diagnosable conditions are all over Finding Nemo. Besides the lucky fin, which again, I would not include, there's Dory's short-term memory loss and Jacques' OCD and Flo's body dysmorphia or schizophrenia or whatever she has. The dentist's tank has been viewed as a kind of comedic Victorian asylum. And furthermore, across the Pixar canon, you have a whole host of broken bodies trying to figure out how to fit into a society that is not accommodating or kind. Broken and torn toys face obsolescence and the trash heap. Broken cars at best find their dreams dashed, and at worst are complete social outcasts. Rusty old robots struggle to adjust to a faster paced world where the people can hardly walk, remember. Their bodies evolve to a kind of infantile dependency on prosthetic technology. Old men in literally fight with prosthetic devices, canes and walkers and even dentures. A chieftain has a wooden leg while his wife experiences temporary mutism by virtue of having become a bear. A fat caterpillar sort of half morphs into a butterfly with exaggeratedly small wings and then comedically celebrates flying as his friends actually lift him into the air. Bodies work with and against their environments, with and against impairment, injury, the physical degradations of aging, imposed environmental limitations or demands, all over the Pixar canon. And yet we don't see them or remember them or register that they are disabilities at all because we read them as other kinds of visual tropes, visual metaphors for, say, being a loser, being a nerd, being in danger, being funny, or whatever. Disability is a visual metaphor that serves a particular narrative, so these situations are invisible as disability, in part because of how they work metaphorically as elements of a story. And this is what Mitchell and Snyder mean by their phrase narrative prosthesis. The disability itself is a crutch on which a story can be built. Disability inaugurates story, for instance, by creating a problem that needs to be solved, or it moves a story forward. This is Buzz Lightyear, whose broken arm propels the existential crisis that ultimately leads him to the sort of wisdom at the end of the film that being loved by a child is all that really matters. Disability may also create an opportunity for a non-disabled character's growth by demanding a change in attitude or behavior. This is like Rain Man, where Raymond's autism is the crutch on which Charlie, the Tom Cruise character, learns to become a decent human being. Disability can also occur in kind of meta-narrative ways that push stories forward. So an injury has in the past led to a character's shame and anger that then leads the character to disrupt the norms of his non-disabled society. This is Captain Hook or any of a number of characters. In fact, disability is very often used to mark villainy, and very often with this shame, anger, meta-narrative behind the character as backstory. The villain is both narratively situated in terms of disability and visually coded by disability. A 2018 article in The Guardian says, "It's as old as cinema itself. If you want to drive home a bad guy's nefarious nature, give them a big facial scar. For as long as films have existed, filmmakers have conflated disfigurement with mental instability or malevolence. And the trope is still going strong. Physical otherness equals evil." End quote. A disability as tragedy that breeds resentment narrative makes villainy seem like a logical consequence of stigmatized disability, and, added bonus, recursively normalizes disability stigma by the repetition of associating disability with villainy. As I said at the beginning of the talk, this is a kind of inference that even small children learn how to do very quickly and surprisingly young. So much so that the explanatory backstory itself is hardly necessary because it is so familiar and so normalized. Cars 2, for instance, hinges on a revenge plot where the disabled cars want revenge for years of having been bullied and not accommodated. And the film almost calls the bullying out. I mean, it does call the bullying out, but then the story seamlessly goes right back to punishing those who want revenge, as if the bullying is natural and normal and appropriate, and the revenge seeking is not. In that film, the revenge seeking is not. It's also really violent. But the idea that that would be what needs to be punished, while the bullying itself really just ought to go without saying, I find super fascinating. And of course, villainy is not the only visual metaphor for which disability is employed. We also have inspiration. This is a perennial favorite, the overcoming disability inspiration story. In the community, this is often called inspiration porn, which is a wonderful phrase, really, which points to the visual pleasure that people get from looking at particular images of disability. And this too tends to be a visual metaphor with a kind of implied narrative backstory of overcoming struggle. This semester, I had my DAS students watch clips from 2 episodes from the first season of Glee because we were talking about representation. Kevin McHale, the actor who plays Artie Abrams, is not a wheelchair user, but he plays one on TV. My initial point with the clips was that representation is not simply a question of fairness. It's not simply a question of people with disabilities kind of benefiting from or wanting to see themselves on screen. Which is also a question of fairness, but it's also a little weird in terms of what kind of pleasure we think people deserve from television and movies. Don't get me wrong, I would find fairness enough of an argument to advocate for people with disabilities influencing all content about people with disabilities. This is the catchphrase, nothing about us without us. But there's an even better argument, I think, if you look at some not great examples of how disability stories get told, again, prosthetically. Artie is a character who was injured in a car accident and has used a wheelchair for literally years. He was a small child when he first became a wheelchair user. But the show depicts him in high school as a victim still overcoming tragedy in order to arrive at a place of sort of resignation, resigned acceptance. In so doing, along the way, he inspires and influences friends to be more woke and compassionate or whatever. There is a long, guiltily pleasurable dream sequence where he gets out of his chair and leads a flash mob in a safety dance number in a shopping mall. But by the end of that episode, Artie has very sensibly given up on his dream of dancing. My students were quick to realize, back to the idea of representation, that if the character had been played by a person who had been a wheelchair user for years, or if one of the writers writing the character had been a wheelchair user for years, the narrative might well have been one of a happy, theatrical, musical, relatively well-adjusted teenager who had no greater identity dysmorphia than any other teenager. Instead, we get a story about disability by and for non-disabled people, which means that disability is more used prosthetically than interrogated, really, or presented as an actual lived experience. There is also comic relief. This may be the easiest to spot and the easiest to overcome, where disability is used as a prosthetic for a familiar comedy trope, fish out of water or unexpected magic, or disability as an excuse for bad behavior or whatever. But then again, in the otherwise really wise and sensitive Pixar film Finding Dory, you get the comic relief characters of Gerald and Becky. Here's Gerald with his bucket and his unspecified special needs. He can't talk, for instance, in a world where other creatures can. He's obsessive over a bucket and a rock, while the other creatures are very philosophical about the presence of the rock. These characteristics make him an object of ridicule, both within and outside the film. That is, the characters ridicule him and the viewers also laugh at him, regardless of how important he ends up being to the successful completion of the narrative. Again, the visual image speaks as loudly or more loudly than the narrative situation of the character. This character, the snail from Monsters University, is one of my favorites. He's a fish out of water for sure, because he foolishly expects to be able to get to class when the bell rings and everyone takes off. The joke being, of course, that he is a snail and therefore can't move very fast. And I had a long argument with a student many years ago about whether he was a snail or a monster. And I insist that he, being a monster at Monsters University, is really just an unaccommodated student at a university that is literally built for monsters. The fact that he can't get to class when the bell rings ought to be viewed as a fault of the university rather than an opportunity to laugh at the body. I have no sense of humor, as you can tell. So what could we see if we looked at disability images from a disability studies perspective? Ideally, we can see where our own stigmas come from and how to dismantle them. Nothing changes until we can all be brave enough to say, oh my gosh, I did that. I thought that, even for a split second. And why did I think that? And how do I not do it next time? We can imagine better and cooler and more fashionable prosthetics. The How to Train Your Dragon film literally hinges on, the whole thing is about the building of a prosthetic device, not hiccups at the end, but toothlesses at the beginning. We could see more actors playing roles where disability is a fact, but not the fact of the characters' lives. R.J. Mitte as Walt Jr. in Breaking Bad is a character whose personality always matters, but whose cerebral palsy seldom does. We could see fulfilling and happy lives, work and love and sex and activity and friendship as normal expectations for disabled people. And when we see these things in the media, we can work harder and better and differently to make them happen in the lives of real people. So there's a show called The Dragon Prince, which I haven't seen, but years ago I walked through the room, carrying a laundry basket or whatever, while my kids were watching it. And there's this dog who has lost his leg, but apparently in the past, when he lost his leg, there's this magical queen or whatever who restored his leg. So the kids in the show are taking this dragon egg to the magic queen so that she can rehabilitate the egg like she has rehabilitated the dog, right? And when they get there, apologies for spoilers, right? But she says, "You misunderstood." She says to the children, "I never restored the dog. I didn't give him a leg. I just put a spell on him so that you would see a leg, because I knew he would be fine with 3, but I also knew you wouldn't treat him as fine." Right? I just about croaked. I wasn't even aware that this was a thing, and my kids were just consuming it as normal Netflix media. But things like this give me profound hope for the future, and this is what animates my work in disability studies. And I would like to kick off the conversation by asking you to think about how could respectful and representational aspects of disability be added to some of your favorite media, but I'd also be very interested in answering any conversations or engaging in any conversation that you would like to have. I will go ahead and stop the share so that I can see more of you and I can see the chat. I think.
Perfect. Well,
Have I done that?
thank you so much, Dr. Wooden. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. Or if it's easier for you, you can raise your hand or maybe do the reaction. That way we can see it easier.
I got a private message on the chat that I'm not sure anybody can see, but I'd like to address it if I may. I'm asked about classes where we've talked about shows that portray autistic people. And I am in a class, I'm teaching a class right now that is offered as English 330, which is a special topics in English, but cross-listed as DAS 397, which is special topics in disability studies. And we just finished a collection of like several weeks on representations of autism, and it has been fascinating. I have taught Mark Haddon's novel, The Curious Incident with the Dog in the Nighttime, plenty of times. I don't know if you're familiar with that novel. It is written by a non-disabled writer, but he got a lot of acclaim for writing from the perspective of a teenager with autism. But it's also 12 or 14 years old now, I think. So we read that, and then we watched Love on the Spectrum, and we also watched, read a book called The Reason I Jump, which is a translated memoir by a Japanese teenager with autism whose mother and teacher help him to transcribe his ideas. And then an English novelist, a different David Mitchell, has translated it into English, right? So we've got this very strangely constructed memoir with images and with these little parables and with this sort of series of mediating influences, the translators all along. But yeah, the 3 of those texts together have been just fascinating, where we start with like ways Mark Haddon helped us to imagine what it was like to be an autistic person, and then representations of actual autistic people who are saying kind of yeah and kind of no, right? First of all, there's a wide variety of us. We have different personalities. Just because we have autism doesn't mean we all have the same personality. But also, especially in the case of The Reason I Jump, the idea that Haddon himself, the writer of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, may have interpreted certain behaviors that he had seen with the same sort of stereotyping that most people use. When we finally get a kid like Naoki Higashida, who wrote The Reason I Jump, we finally get him saying, for some of us at least, that's not what that behavior means, right? So people have been interpreting that behavior like the tendency to be by oneself, right? People have been interpreting that behavior as, I don't care very much about being with people. As an autistic person, I'm not very social. And then Naoki Higashida says, actually, I'm very social. I want to be around people a lot. I just am always afraid I'm doing it wrong. I'm always afraid that I'm bothering them, right? So yes, and there's so much more to do. There's so much more to do. I have not talked about atypical in a class yet, and I haven't talked about the good doctor in a class yet, but it's wonderful how much there is to say, how much there is to see, I should say.
Perfect. We have another question from Cheyenne Rocket. So she asked, can we find subconscious stigmas as a disability, considering that we live in a world that demands a level of mutual understanding of certain issues in order to survive? I cope and better our lives in today's socially demanding society, or else we would not have doctors, psychologists, etc.
That is a wonderful question. Like, are we all in a way disabled by the stigmas that we hold subconsciously? Am I understanding your question right? I think that's wonderful. And I love that use of the social model, really. If what our environment expects of us increasingly is a widespread sense of cooperative tolerance, then yeah, harboring disability stigmas subconsciously could really get in the way of our ability to do that. If I'm understanding your question correctly, I think that's a very clever way of turning the tables, a very interesting way to think about our tendency to stigmatize actually hurting ourselves more, even more, maybe even more than those tendencies hurt other people.
Perfect. Do you want to read that, or do you want me to read it?
Well, I've got another one in a private chat that I want to look at as well, from Justin. Hi, Justin. Um, who says, what about universities and how we portray disability? So what tips could we give to student affairs or other university departments or administration on how to provide a positive message about disability inclusion in their media in a way that is not saviorism or showcasing disability as inspiration or using the same picture of a person with a disability in media for years to come? That's really funny. And I noticed a few years ago on the disability studies minor page, if you opened it in one browser, it had this picture of a blind person walking down the sidewalk, maybe a couple of blind people walking down the sidewalk with canes. And then if you opened it in another browser, it cut all their heads off. Maybe that's something that we want to fix. No, I love this question. And I was thinking about this yesterday in the other panel. One thing that I don't think our university does just very, very well yet, and I think our university does a lot of things well, I don't think we do faculty training very well. And I think we could do a lot more with faculty and staff training, that really is less about, everybody use person first language, and really more about, you're all smart people. So let us actually think about dismantling some of the structures that we have put in place, even if they are unspoken ideological structures, right? But I honestly have thought about this some, because I feel like we kind of played a game of not it for a while, right? And I think it's because none of us feel really deeply and well trained to do this, because the conversation is so fresh. There never has been any real training, right? So if I'm going to be the one who trains the faculty, I don't have any formal training. Do I? How much formal training do I need? Who trained me? Right? When I was in school, nobody was talking about this at all. So I didn't get any formal training, right? So somewhere along the way, somebody's got to say, okay, I'll do it imperfectly, and I'll read all the books I can, and I'll make a big giant mess of it because I'm not an expert. But somebody's got to step up, right? So there are some things that we could do. There are some sorts of training that we could have, right? I'm not sure that I can rattle off tips, but I'm sure that if we put our heads together, we could come up with ways of educating our already very well educated faculty and staff and administration in a thing that they've never been asked to think very much about before, right? Let me give you a quick example. I don't know how we're doing on time, and I see Riley's got a question, and I don't want to just blah 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 forever. But I was in a advisor training session, I don't know, a couple of 3 years ago, and there was a presenter from, I want to say the DRC, but it was probably counseling and testing, probably not the DRC, and I can't swear to it. But she was talking about how we have to give, like a student who has a disability accommodation for extra time on tests, how we as faculty members have to give what, time and a half or something on tests. And I had just been at a different workshop that was about universal design. Different people, two totally different parts of the campus, one staff and administration, I think, and one faculty. And I said at this meeting, what if I just make it a take-home test? What if everybody has all the time they need? And the student was like, or the presenter was like, well, you still have to give time and a half to your students who have disability accommodation. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense, because I can't give infinity and a half. I can't, I mean, there's no point in giving everybody 3 days and this person 5 days if I want them to take a 2-hour test and I'm not going to time it, right? There has to be a way to talk about universal design as an intellectual pursuit and not just a kind of list of administrative tasks that we have to, boxes that we have to check in order to get it right. If that makes sense. That's what I would like to see us do, is actually ask big picture questions instead of just, tips or workshops on how to do it right. So anytime you want to sit down and brainstorm with me, Justin, I'm all about it.
Perfect. So Riley asked, along the lines of your question posed on the last slide, I believe we need to represent disabled bodies in the mainstream media with individuals with that disability. Instead of having able-bodied individuals representing disabled characters, me before you, wonder, the theory of everything, just as we have seen with society calling for representation amongst the LGBTQ plus community in varying races.
Yeah, I would actually go you one further, I think, Riley. I think you're absolutely right. And when we really get there, we will have non-disabled actors who can effectively play disabled characters sometimes, right? I think Leonardo DiCaprio and Gilbert Grape was probably a better choice than, right? But we'll also have disabled actors playing characters without necessary defining disabilities, right? The reason I put RJ Mitty from Breaking Bad on that slide is that his character, Walt Jr., was not originally conceived as a character with cerebral palsy. RJ Mitty just auditioned so well that they were like, oh, okay, we can make him Walter White's kid, right? Very seldom in that show does his disability matter. Once in a while it does, because we're not just saying, I don't even see your disability, you're just perfectly normal, right? Once in a while his disability does matter, but most of the time other parts of his personality and character matter, right? The drama of his family relationships matter more than how strong his legs are at any given moment, right? So I completely agree with you about representation, and I aspire to, I want to live to see a world in which it doesn't matter quite so much because the representations themselves are not stigmatized. There is a crime show, a British, I don't know, quarantine, I've watched 9,000 hours of cop shows. Crime is my thing, right? There's a British crime show called Silent Witness. It's just a procedural. There are like 35 seasons or something. She's a forensic anthropologist. It's like Britain's Bones. But there's a character on it who is one of the higher ups. She's one of the important administrative figures in the forensic lab, and she is a wheelchair user, and nobody ever says anything about it. She just is. That's just who she is as a character. I haven't watched all of the episodes, but I haven't seen an episode yet where anybody says anything about the fact that she's in a wheelchair until one time somebody shows up and he is also in a wheelchair and he makes a comment on it and she like cuts him off. It's really funny that in that split second, she's like, come on, we're here to solve a crime. We're not here to talk about our wheelchairs. Right.
Awesome. Any other questions? I know Riley made another comment saying just as trans individuals may play that gender they are and not to be that trans
Yeah.
actor or individual in that media production.
Exactly. Exactly.
Any other last questions? All right, got one. Where can I find the recording? Great question. I know a couple people have asked and I've been individually responding. So it'll be on the Disability Resource Center website. Can't guarantee exactly when that will be, but hopefully within the next week or two, we'll put it up there. So that way everyone can access it if you came in a little bit late, or you can refer to a friend or family member that you think would be beneficial to hear this, this talk. So yeah. And seeing no other questions, I want to respect everyone's time. I do first off want to say thank you so much for Dr. Wooden for giving that great presentation. And I know I gained a lot from it, and I think it was super beneficial. Um, uh, uh, so coming up tomorrow, we have a social media accessibility training by Tuan Madison and Ty Davenport. Both are staff members in the Access Technology Center in the Disability Resource Center. So they'll be sharing how to make your social media accessible, which again is a big part of kind of what we were talking about today, representation, just making sure everyone has access. And so that will be really great. It will be from 2:30 to 3:30 in Pummel 306 and also on Zoom. And then finally, I'm gonna post in the chat really quick a survey that I would love y'all to fill out. It's just a quick 5-question survey. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming, and we'll see y'all tomorrow.
Thank you for putting it together, Austin.